Hi everyone, welcome to the IoT Hero Show, my weekly showcase of thought leadership in the Internet of Things. My name is Tom Raftery, I'm the Global IoT Evangelist for SAP, and now, on with the show. Hi everyone, welcome to the IoT Hero Show. My name is Tom Raftery. I am VP IoT SAP. And with me on the show today, I have Jon Reed. Jon, welcome to the show.
Thanks. I'm not an IoT hero or IoT expert, or I'm not even sure if I'm a hero. I'm pretty sure I'm not. But
introduce yourself, Jon. Who are you? Who is Jon Reed?
But I do have a cool hat, though. I challenge. I knew you might don your hat, so I challenge you to a hat face-off here with my Red Sox hat.
There you go.
But yeah, I am a co-founder of Diginomica. We are enterprise media with attitude. We try to cover the impact of digital on enterprises, but hopefully in a way that isn't loaded with bullshit and buzzwords, and helps companies to really make sense of the journey ahead of them. And the reason I swore so early on your podcast is just because I think it's important to cut through some of the claptrap around this and just get real, because I think that's when I talk with customers, that's where they're at. There's a reality to what's going on with companies right now, and it has to do with a lot of changes we're experiencing globally, both culturally, politically, and also technology-wise, and that's what's driving this, not buzzwords.
Sure. Sure. That makes a lot of sense. And if people want to find Diginomica, it's at diginomica.com.
That is, and I've got our Twitter handles rolling behind us. So I'm John ERP, you're Tom Raftery. Find us online to continue the discussion.
Superb. Jon, we were both at the SAP Sapphirenow event 2 weeks ago now, and I said it would be nice to bring you on the show to have you talk about your impressions of that event, because, you know, you're not SAP, I am, so my impressions might be a little bit biased. What did you make of the show, specifically around Leonardo and all the kind of SAP topics related to that?
So I think SAP had a fairly significant challenge at the show. I've always felt that you should never read too much into a particular show. Never get too high after a good one, never get too low after a bad one, because it's really about how you follow through. But I think what a show can do for you is it can kind of establish in people's minds a sense of direction and essentially challenge yourself to where you want to go. And so what SAP, I think, was trying to do with Leonardo specifically was to help its customers understand that we are on top of the changes that are happening that you're experiencing, and that we have solutions that are relevant to the problems that you're having. And I referred to Leonardo after the conference in a podcast as next-gen kitchen sink, and that may be sort of the most accurate description that I've heard so far. And I could probably try to define it a little better, but essentially I see it as sort of an umbrella where SAP is trying to organize a collection of tools, applications, services that pertain to the kinds of things we hear about all the time, whether it's machine learning or Internet of Things, your bailiwick. You could also put blockchain in there. SAP wanted to create an umbrella of tools around this concept.
So just to take a step back, Jon, for anyone who wasn't there or didn't hear the announcements, SAP Leonardo was pre-Sapphire SAP's IoT innovation portfolio, but at the event we announced that we were expanding it to include lots of other technologies like analytics, big data, blockchain, machine learning. I've probably missed a few others that we decided to throw in there. Hence your kitchen sink comment. What does that make sense to you?
It does as a beginning point. I think SAP did succeed in making clear that they're on top of where a lot of these things are going. However, I think there is a lot left to fill out, and there was something to be desired towards the end, I thought, in terms of, I heard a lot of buzzword jargon-laden stuff. I wrote down some phrases that really drove me nuts during some of the keynotes. One of them was advanced design thinking methodologies, which is just a horrible phrase that should be buried 100 feet below Waldorf. What does that even mean? You know, and I think SAP has to be a little careful with some of that. In behind the scenes meetings, what I heard that I really liked had to do with, we're going to collaborate with our customers and share this journey with them, and we're all kind of in the same boat. And I would have liked to hear a little more of that type of messaging. But the other thing that we need to keep in mind is that SAP was in a little bit of a predicament around the issues of empathy and trust because of the litigation that has occurred in the last 6 months to a year that has really brought up this issue of indirect access, which has really been an issue for SAP and a lot of vendors for a long time. But the reason this kind of matters to this conversation is that indirect access is sort of a jargony way of talking about how do we price usage of the system around data. And of course, all of these new models are data driven. And so SAP had to speak to that topic, and I think Bill McDermott deserves some credit for addressing that early in his keynote and being very specific around it. Now, some people felt like it was insufficient and incomplete, and there was criticism around it, but I think the fact that it was put on the table is good, and that's another piece that SAP will continue to have to work through. But they're not the only company, to be fair, that's sorting through the notion of how do we create models around this. And I think you had actually blogged about the before Sapphire, when you were talking about IoT stuff at SAP around new ways of pricing, the fixed price models and stuff like that around certain projects. And I think those kinds of things have a lot of potential as well. So we'll have to continue that conversation.
Yeah. The pricing one is always a difficult one, particularly, as you say, as you're moving from a situation where you've got licensed individual users versus now licensed things, and do you charge by the number of things or by the transactions, or how does that all work out? And it's that's going to be an interesting one to watch.
I think to some extent I was also a little bit disappointed that SAP didn't take a little bit of a stronger position in the keynote around sort of what you might call the purpose behind all of this. I heard a little too much whiz-bang tech and not enough about, so in the press conference after the keynote, someone asked the board members, the entire board was assembled, they said, you guys are talking about global solutions and a global mentality towards business. In the meantime, globalism is under, as an approach to solving problems, is under serious attack. And I'm not going to pick on my own president, but in a sense, the nationalistic sort of tendencies we're experiencing right now, and people retrenching into their own sort of cultures and ethnicities and what have you, and pulling back from this notion of global business. And I think SAP could have taken a much stronger position around that. And you see right now that technology companies are doing that in a lot of different ways. Around LGBTQ legislation in the U.S., there's some new announcements about tech companies taking stands around that. Elon Musk is threatening to leave a couple of the committees that he's on with Trump if Trump withdraws from the Paris Accords. And so we're seeing tech companies take unprecedented stands, and I think SAP could have done a better job of saying we are in some global turmoil right now, and SAP has a strong belief in a global community, in a sense, in a global network, and we're taking a stand around that. I think they missed an opportunity there to show a little more conviction around that, but I do think they have it. I just think it was more of a missed opportunity to express it that I think would have resonated with people and help people to see. Because with big companies, it's always like, how do you root for this company? How do I identify with this company? And I think that's something SAP could really take a stand on. They've done such a nice job, for example, with the business without bias stuff that I did a video interview on at the conference. But I think in a global perspective, they really missed an opportunity.
Interesting. No, that's a good point. And I know that from some of the internal communications I've seen, it would have been, you're right on message there, basically. What you're saying is very much the company attitude. And I mean, you wouldn't have brought it up if you didn't think that yourself.
Yeah, and the thing is that it all kind of relates to how you're going to position all this stuff, right? Because The one thing that I think we lost track of a little bit at the show, like in the keynotes, for example, I thought there were too many demos of like a hypothetical company. Like they used more like hypothetical scenarios. They did have some customers on stage too, which was good. But in the IoT space, for example, Tom, there's some fairly mature and interesting applications, and also some really cool startups that are propping up in the SAP community that I think could have been showcased to show that Leonardo isn't just a sort of an aspirational collection of tools. Like, for example, on the blockchain side, I would argue SAP's tools are very immature. But in IoT, there's actually quite a lot of stuff that's fairly well developed now. And I think it would have been interesting to show off a little bit more of that. And I think that's another thing for SAP to do after the conference is, okay, you establish this sort of next-gen umbrella, but now what's really happening out in the field that's making a difference for people? I mean, even 2 years ago, I was writing about predictive maintenance, for example, which was an early IoT play that has a lot of use cases now. So,
yeah, no, that's a fair point. The only thing I'd say as against that, and not even as against that, as kind of an add-on to that, and as an opportunity for me to get a plug-in, is we have our Leonardo Live event in July in Frankfurt, and we'll have 50 customers at that demoing IoT solutions. Right there, we'll get to see a lot more of the innovations that have happened with customers with IoT. Everything from, I think the city of Buenos Aires is going to be there. I think, if I remember correctly, Microsoft are going to be there. So partners, customers, Red Bull are going to be there, if I remember correctly as well. There's a whole slew of them going to be there. So that if you want your fill of IoT customers and wins, that's the place to be.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a really good event for SAP, and it's a logical follow-on to Sapphirenow. And that was kind of my point around, like, there's only so much you can accomplish in one show, and so what I'm saying now is not just some criticism of the show, it's also sort of what the opportunities that lie ahead. I think there's sort of a fork in the road ahead for SAP in terms of we could double down on some of the jargony messaging, or we could kind of focus more on what's really happening in the field and focus a little more on global problems and values. I'm not sure if the messages totally got across in the one of the famous parts, and you can watch this online because there's a press conference replay. One of the analysts or media at the press conference asks in sort of a plaintive manner, "What is Leonardo?" The simplest. So, this kind of thing takes a little bit of time, I think, to hammer out. But to me, I think what I find interesting is that I came into a lot of this as sort of I guess you could say an Internet of Things skeptic, and that's sort of I've always been this way, but I have a knee-jerk response to things being pushed down my throat. So a lot of times things I've come to appreciate later, I had to do in my own time, like as I and that's a big thing with Diginomica too, where we spend a lot of time talking to customers and writing about their experiences, and it's through hearing those stories that you start to see, yeah, actually this does resonate. And last week on Diginomica, Derek Dupree's wrote a couple of pieces from, it was actually a Salesforce event. Sorry about that, SAP, but it was a Shell downstream CIO basically saying, I'm scared, and it was a huge, like, kind of confessional in a way, wow, but an appropriate one. Him saying, like, what is he scared of? A lot of it is he's scared of changing business conditions, and he's scared of being disrupted. It's not a marketing gimmick for him. It's the fact that, and technologists in general are more responsible now for the business. It's not enough to say, oh, no one hacked us this year, so we're okay. Our system, we had 100% system uptime. Well, okay, that's expected, but then what else, right? What are you delivering? And so that's where a lot of this comes from, and that's where the urgency behind this is coming for people, is that they're seeing this. And where I got interested with IoT is where I saw how there's something that starts to happen with IoT where you're starting to think about new data sources, right? So you're thinking about, how can my business change if I had greater visibility into a lot of things that in the past could never communicate with me, but now they can, right? So a Wi-Fi router might communicate with me. A hubcap might communicate with me. A wine bottle might communicate with me. What does that mean to my business? And a lot of it has to do in the first round, I think, with just more visibility, more efficiency, better use of inventory, serving customers better. But then, and I know you've seen this too because you have a show called IoT Heroes. What starts to happen, it seems, is that people start accumulating this data, and then they start thinking about, wow, like this data in and of itself is an asset, right? And so now I could start thinking about my business in a different way as well. I mean, I think the last time you and I talked in Barcelona, you brought up the Kaiser example, right, around air, which was just a classic of like, well, now we can sell this as a service, which had never been done before. And so as I went further down the journey, that's when I started to appreciate like that, that there actually is some meat on the bone there. And that's what makes these discussions, I think, interesting in the long run. It's just important for people to realize that, SAP is going to have challenges around the fact that there's a lot of companies offering these solutions. I mean, I've been to a lot of conferences this spring, and you would think that each vendor invented AI and each vendor invented IoT. And so that's why I come back to like partnership. It's like, I think it's about partnership and trust, and that's a big part of the message.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Obviously, it is about partnership. I mean, there is no one single company who can do it all for everyone. So everyone is having to partner with everyone. It's an interesting time in the business.
It is, and I think that was one thing that I think was really strong in Bernd Leichert's keynote. And by the way, I think he's really come into his own. Like and I don't want to sound too critical, but his first keynote, I just wondered if he would be a fit on the big stage when I saw him after that keynote, because I was like, that seemed awkward. But he's come a really long way, and I thought his message of openness was, I think, fairly dramatic, and it's not the first time it's been expressed, but I think he did it very well. And just to be clear, openness in this context is about the fact that no one vendor is going to be able to deliver all these solutions. And so if you can't essentially play nice in the neighborhood of all these open source tools and all these different platforms, you're not going to be part of things. And so I think SAP has started to really realize that, but it may take a while for that to trickle down to all areas inside of SAP to really understand the implications of that. But certainly the SAP Cloud Platform team, for example, understands that very well. So,
yeah, agreed. You mentioned before I turned on the recorder here, you mentioned that there were a couple of things that you saw there that you wouldn't mind talking about at the event. I mean, do you want to go into some of that?
Yeah. So, I mean, we shot a lot of videos in the studio, and a lot of the customers there spoke to the themes that you and I are talking about. We didn't actually have like a classic, like what you might call IoT customer, but there were some interesting ones. One that I really like that is a little more on the machine learning side, but also is IoT, was a company called Quantipply. And
John, just to interrupt you there a sec. Send me the links for these, and I'll put them in the show notes so people can click through and catch them afterwards as well.
Yeah, I'll send you guys a link. We have a 20 video playlist, and it's got a bunch of customers, also a few startups that are doing interesting stuff. There's a thing on the Quantipply. What they did is they were building a machine learning engine, and they were looking for the best use case, and they ended up going after money laundering. And so as it turns out, like, money laundering is an extremely difficult problem from a machine learning perspective, because the people that are doing money laundering and performing fraud are thinking about not standing out. So the whole point of machine learning is about detecting patterns, and money launderers don't want to have patterns because they don't want to be detected. Yeah. So it's a very interesting challenge that they did, and they built some of these tools. They ended up building onto onto extending onto HANA for some of their integrations. They're not like fully SAP. They have their own technology as well. But a great example of collaborating with SAP on a solution that I liked a lot. And one of the reasons I like that example is that there's only so many broad plays that can be made of like, we're creating the next gen platform for this or that. What I think companies really need is industry specific stuff that really helps them with the problem they're having today. And the more that stuff is available through applications that partners and startups have built, the stronger the ecosystem looks to customers. And so things like this for a financial institution could be very, very appealing. And so that was a really interesting example. We also interviewed a company called Vectus Industries, which is making its own journey towards IoT-based solutions. They started with S4HANA, but then they got deeper into the IoT component of their business. And so this is kind of what happens a lot of times, is that your companies start by modernizing and simplifying their architectures, but then once they do that, it seems like they are finding a way to move forward with IoT-based projects. I can tell you more about Vectus in a minute, but I don't know, did you see any interesting examples of your own?
So I thought one of the more interesting ones, one of the more interesting actually booths that I went by was the FedM one, the digital twin solution that was, demoed off the main stage. Right. But actually, if you went to the pod they had a beautiful little demo, extremely simple. What it was a thin metal strip standing up vertically with a bolt on the top of it. And that was connected to a laptop. And on the screen of the laptop, you had a digital representation of this thin metal strip with the bolt on it.
Oh, right, yeah.
And as you pull the bolt to the left, the digital representation showed it going to the left. And as you brought it to the right, the digital representation again showed it going to the right. So that was nice just by itself. But more than that, what it was doing was, on the metal strip in the digital representation, you had color-coded the stresses that were happening to the thin metal strip as it was bending to the left or to the right. And the stresses varied depending where they were on that strip. So this was, digital sensors, in some cases virtual sensors,
right,
calculating where and when the stresses were happening on the, in this case, thin metal strip. But you could imagine it being engine cowlings on jets, or you could imagine it being wind turbine bases, or anything that has stresses or forces being applied to it. And not alone is it able to calculate those stresses and strains, but obviously those are then recorded, and the chances of the thing, whatever it is, getting to a point where it's going to fail can be predicted ahead of time, and then in the case of FedM, and FedM is a company we acquired last summer. In their case, the first customer I think they had was a thing called Arctic Wind, which is a wind farm in the north of Norway above the Arctic Circle. And obviously they didn't want to be sending engineers to site to test out, when the wind was blowing, whether or not these turbines were being negatively affected and were about to fall over. So instead they had digital twins of them where they could see the stresses and strains from the strong winds that occurred there, and whether they were likely to fail. So it's a nice solution, but in fact the demo they had was very simple and showed clearly what it was the solution does.
Yeah, and one thing, if people get a chance, also check out the HANA Innovation Award winners. There's some pretty interesting stuff in there. The Vectus group, the one that I was talking about, they got a second place in one of those. But I think what's really interesting about some of these is that a lot of them have some social purpose behind them as well. Vectis is in the situation of trying to offer reliable and safe water storage in India, where that can be an issue. But what's really interesting as you watch these examples unfold is they seem to have several patterns, like from a customer perspective. One is, we were bogged down in confusing legacy spaghetti. We were working out of spreadsheets and it was highly inefficient. We went to a more modern ERP, which in this case was S/4HANA. We got a lot more visibility, a lot more integration, and then we started looking at the possibilities of what's next. And a lot of times what you see, and this is what Vectis did, is they built mobile apps that I think their app also got an award of its own, but basically so you can now give your plumbers a mobile app. They're on site with customers. They're interacting and sharing data that they never had before. And then through that, then you see the next phase, which we didn't get into too much with them in the video, but how they're starting to think about transitioning into a services business. And so the Innovation Awards have a bunch of different examples of that, some of which are definitely IoT specific. There was one that I didn't get to talk about. It was like I'll find it in a sec, but I don't know. Did you spend any time with NextView?
I didn't. No. Who are they?
They develop smart applications in big data, process mining, and Internet of Things. And what they were doing is like helping facilitate harvesting and field operations and cultivation for farmers and stuff like sugar producers, for example. So anyway, process mining is turning into like one of the big sexy phrases, right? That there's all this transactional data that has never really been used for other purposes before. Anyway, they got a Process Innovation Award in the Innovation Awards. I didn't get to talk with them, but hopefully I will at some point. But I think the point is that the SAP ecosystem is bursting with these kinds of examples, and so I think to a large extent that's a validation that SAP is on the right track. The caveat, of course, is that there's a lot of vendors doing kick-ass stuff in this area, so it doesn't by definition mean that SAP will dominate these next areas the way you could argue that it dominated ERP. I don't think that's a given at all. And yet I'm not sure that's the most important point anyway. I think the more important point is how they relate to their customers and how they establish, like we talked about. It's a combination of a close partnership with your customers, but also supporting them to be open. One thing I saw at another vendor show this year that really struck me, and I didn't see this at Sapphire, but it was very powerful. A cloud ERP vendor, did a demo with one of their competitor CRM products and showing off the integration. And I was like, yeah, this is the world we live in now. Like, companies are going to choose the pieces that fit best for them. And we have to accept the fact that if we provide business value, we'll be part of the discussion, and that's okay if we're not everything. It's funny because Hasso brought up NetWeaver and stuff, and it was really funny because it was like NetWeaver was a great example of like a promise that never lived up to its hype in terms of like, SAP's going to solve all your integration woes, right? And now, you'd be hard pressed to find someone use the word NetWeaver at a conference, like, and if they do it with a little bit of like self-consciousness, and so there's a lesson learned there, right? Which is like, let's not do that again. Like, let's not try to create some be all end all solution for people. Let's try to be more interoperable and learn from open source communities, which I think is what SAP is humbling itself to do a little bit, which is not easy for SAP. SAP isn't always the most humble company in that regard. I think it might be a German engineering thing to some extent, right? And I don't mean that in a bad way too. It's that like we make the best cars in the world kind of thing, right? And so SAP make the best software in the world or whatever, but the world is changing now, and you can't just build the best software if you have to build the best platform and ecosystem, and that's a whole different can of worms.
Yeah. The other thing that impressed me, I don't know if you saw this, but there was the Leonardo demo area in the center of the show floor. and it was this big kind of circular thing with lots of lights and two entrances, front and back. And I wandered through it and had a look into the center part where there was the actual demo area, but I didn't go in because anytime I went by it, there was two queues, front and back, of people waiting to go in. And I've been at lots of Sapphires, no more than yourself, and I've never, ever, ever seen people queuing up to get a demo of anything SAP. I was blown away. And it was for the 3 days that I was there. Anytime I passed by, I looked in. Is any chance I could go in now? No? Okay, forget it.
Well, yeah, and I think that's, first of all, it's a good example of show floor design. We don't get a lot of chances to get on the show floor because we're always like in meetings and videos and stuff. But I noticed that area walking by, and I was like, wow, that it did look kind of appealing. It's like it's sort of inviting, and so I think that's part of it. But I think also it kind of gets back to our point that I think customers are they're engaged on these issues on some fundamental level because it does pertain to what they're doing. At the same time, they want to test drive, and so yeah, I mean that's an ideal thing, and probably considered a win for the show given the lines. I've never heard of that before.
Yeah.
Usually people have to drag you kicking and screaming into those things. So
I think it speaks to an innate curiosity that people have. This idea of digital transformation has been talked about for a while, and Internet of Things has been talked about for a while. But now I suspect customers are actually saying, look, it's time we actually took a step in this direction and see what it is we need to be doing.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing SAP's got to think about a little bit more too, is that as these ventures proliferate inside of companies, there becomes a real need to manage them better and administrate them better. And it'll be interesting to hear what SAP comes up with as for tools to do that. I know a lot of vendors are trying to do that because customers now say, well, we've had this successful initiative in this one region or whatever, but now we have 5 IoT projects going. It's getting complex to manage all these projects. And I think that's one area where SAP could potentially play a stronger role than it has. It's not as much of an issue today because a lot of customers aren't there yet, but that's going to be a big problem is managing this. And it comes up a lot in the context of microservices because a lot of these applications essentially can be broken down into much smaller collections of services that provide a very specific function. And when I write about microservices, I always got a lot of pushback from enterprise people on Twitter saying, this is just the new complexity. Like this is going to just create even more of what we were trying to get away from. And I think that's going to be an interesting challenge as we go forward. And SAP didn't talk that much about that, but I think they probably have some plans, I would think, in the works there.
Okay. Jon, we're coming to the end of the show because we're running out of time. We've been on for about 30 minutes at this point. Anything else that you want to add to that about your impressions of the show, or SAP, or IoT, or XYZ, or?
Well, I guess I would just encourage anyone listening to not take my word for it or your word for it, but to invest the time and energy in trying to better understand what this all means. The one thing that I get a little frustrated with is when people don't understand stuff, but they don't try to take the initiative, because it takes effort to go through these slide decks sometimes, and SAP is far from perfect in that regard as well. They just issued a blockchain announcement today that was so full of jargon that it may need to be made fun of. But the point is that you can scoff, but it's important to understand what blockchain is, and what it and the problems that it purports to solve. How widespread that will become, we don't know yet. At first, it looked like it might become the next internet. I don't know that I feel that way anymore, but I do feel like it is certainly going to have use cases that matter. And this is not the time to relax. This is the time to take it upon ourselves to better understand this. And so I would just say, have a healthy distrust of everything you hear, but then also, seek out as much information as you can, and and compare different solutions and try to understand why this is happening, because SAP is not doing this just to sell more product. I mean, obviously they're in growth mode and they want to sell more product, and so that's part of what is going on here. But they are trying to speak to real change that is happening, and they're trying to be relevant to customers. And whether they end up being relevant is a long story that we talked about that invokes everything from pricing to data access to empathy and everything else. So SAP, the verdict on SAP is still out, but that's true of a lot of vendors in this space. So I would just encourage people to just to really get involved and try to better understand this stuff, because if you sit on your butt right now and watch the world go by and cling to whatever it is you're doing, I do think the danger of becoming irrelevant is really, really high right now. And that's not even discussing all the AI and machine learning stuff we didn't even get into. So,
yeah. Where's your skepticism on blockchain coming from? You said at one point it was going to be the whole internet, and now you think it might have a specific few use cases. So where did the shrinkage in the vision come from?
Well, I went to a blockchain show, and I got a better understanding of what some of the obstacles with blockchain are, and that there's a lot of different pieces to that conversation. Part of it is that you get back to the question of first of all, that there are no industry standards yet that have really evolved for how enterprises can use blockchains. There's a lot of regulatory hurdles with blockchains in a lot of industries that could be most impacted by blockchain in a positive way, like healthcare and financial services. A lot of companies, even startups, were waiting on legislation that clarified different aspects of who owns data, how does this get validated, how the reporting works and stuff like that. This notion of the blockchain is appealing in a lot of ways, because it can create a much more decentralized way to validate information. So very appealing to solve problems, especially you can imagine in rural areas where you want to validate land titles and things like that. Blockchain seems like an ideal solution for things like that.
In fact, the Republic of Georgia turned its land registry over to a blockchain.
Yeah. And so I think it's one of those things where there's just not that many things in the history of technology that have truly revolutionized everything that we do. But then certain things do find a niche of sorts where they have some relevance, and they do matter. And I certainly think that blockchain is going to find a way forward. Without going into too much detail, there's been a lot of community issues with blockchain. It gets deep into open source lingo, but things like hard forks, for example, people fighting political fights over directions and stuff. Right. And I think when you're an enterprise and you see you're about to invest in a technology where you have communities that are at each other's throats over the future of certain protocols and stuff, it does give you a little bit of pause, right? Yeah. Because that's the downside of open source stuff, right? Is that you are dependent upon communities that are... The thing you have to understand is that blockchain comes from a Bitcoin community environment. Some of the Bitcoin people are not about making institutions better. The whole notion was to topple corrupt, what they perceive as corrupt financial institutions. So there's some very radical individuals involved in some of this stuff, and they have an agenda that is not what you would call corporate friendly. That's not what they're about. And you'll find out about this if you write. I don't know if you've had this experience, but if you write about this stuff, you'll hear from some of these folks, and they don't appreciate this stuff being appropriated into they want a totally radical decentralized kind of thing, but you look at it from an enterprise perspective, and radical decentralization isn't really a buzzword you hear at conferences, right?
Or at boardroom level.
Yeah, you hear more about digital boardrooms than radical decentralization, right? So I think it's just hurdles and growing pains, and I will say that those who are interested in blockchain, I would suggest following the Hyperledger project.
Yeah,
I know that SAP has dipped its toes in Hyperledger a bit.
Yeah, we became a premium member back in March, I think it was.
Yeah, IBM gets a lot of credit for aggressively pursuing this, but other companies have been involved as well. But Hyperledger seems to have the most traction in terms of sorting out the things that enterprise needs around blockchain. I've also been monitoring Ethereum, but Ethereum was one of the communities that get caught up in some very divisive debates around forks and splits and stuff, and they may end up like porting some of their stuff into Hyperledger and stuff. But Hyperledger ends up being like so essentially what you need a collection of people who are really committed to enterprising these technologies, and that's happening. But judging from the press release coming from SAP today, they have a long way to go to figure out how they're going to offer that to their customers. But it's a start. So,
sure. Jon, if people want to reach out to you, follow you, follow Diginomica, what, where, when, how should they go? What's the best way to do it?
It's all about your consumption preferences, right? If you go on Diginomica.com, you can track us on Twitter, you can subscribe to email, you can hit me up on Twitter or LinkedIn, or even Facebook if that's your druthers, whatever you prefer. I try to be omni-channel as much as possible. I think it's a lot easier for me to be omni-channel than it is for a large company. So, but we do like to hear your feedback because you and I are just two guys shooting the breeze. I mean, I think you would agree that we're only smarter because of all the people that challenge us and share information, and that's how we get better. So please be in touch.
And for people who are not watching this on video but listening to it in podcast, your Twitter handle is JONERP. Just for that.
That is.
I'll put it in the show notes as well for anyone. And Diginomica.com is spelled as it sounds. Cool. Jon, that's been fantastic. It's been a great conversation. Thanks a million for coming on the show today.
Enjoyed it. Pleasure, Tom. Thanks.